Thank you very much, Vincent. It's a pleasure, a real pleasure for me to be here this afternoon. Although I don't come from the Jesuit tradition, I had the opportunity to work closely with a number of Jesuit organizations when I worked at the UN on trying to establish schools in refugee camps and in preventing children from being recruited into armies when they were just 10 or 11 years old. So I have enormous respect for the work that Jesuit organizations do. And I know that understanding other peoples and other cultures is very much a part of your tradition. So I'd like to talk today about how you can update that part of your mission in a 21st century context. I'm going to leave about 20 minutes at the end, and I hope that in that time we can perhaps have not just questions but also some discussion and brainstorming about how your schools and the Jesuit network can further the development of global citizens for the 21st century. Oops. Okay, I'm not a Mac user, so this is a new machine for me. So I'm going to talk a bit about the new global context and why I think it means we need our students will need new kinds of skills. I'll then go on to talk about some schools that are trying to develop a more global mission so that their students can graduate with global competence and as global citizens. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about what I think the special and almost unique role your network could play. So first, it's often said that our schools today are teaching 21st century students with 20th century teachers and curriculum in 19th century buildings. And it certainly sometimes seems as if our schools are very slow to change, and sometimes we despair that they're impossible to change. But they actually do change. In the 18th and 19th century, their curriculum was very heavily agricultural and Latin and Greek. In the 20th century, as manufacturing and science became important, the curriculum really changed to include those elements. So in the 21st century, which is a global and a digital age, how do we need to update the curriculum for that period? After all, the students who are coming in as kindergartners to our school system today will graduate around 2024, and they'll be in the labor market until 2070. Now, we can't possibly know what the world will be like, but we can begin to see some of the trends that are shaping it. Economic trends we read about in the newspapers every day. Global trade agreements, an expanding number of jobs in most countries, and I know there are countries from different parts of the world with differing degrees of integration into the global economy. But global trade is only going to accelerate, and the parts of the world that are developing fastest are those outside of the traditional developed areas. So Asia, South America, parts of Africa are going to be a much bigger part of the global economy than in the past. And because of the wiring of the world around starting around the year 2000, companies can manufacture goods anywhere, anytime. We know that consumer demand in the rapidly growing economies of China and India are having huge impacts all around the world, and that a financial crisis caused by one or two banks in Europe can really affect the ability of farmers in Africa and South America to borrow money for their crops. So this degree of interconnectedness in the economic sense is getting more and more. But it's also true, and our last panel talked about that, and it's perhaps in the environmental area that we understand this degree of interdependence most vividly, most profoundly, because the changes that are happening in climate change and biodiversity are so profound that they may have an impact on the whole human race. So we have no choice but to try to address those problems, and those problems can only be addressed through international collaboration. They are not contained within borders. Human security, we know that diseases these days, because of travel, spread rapidly around the world, and that poverty, injustice, lack of human rights lead to conflicts that spill over borders. No man or no country can be an island anymore. Finally, culturally, and here The changes are phenomenal. The extent of cultural interchange, particularly among younger people, is quite extraordinary. In fact, in the public health world, people refer to global teenagers, because teenagers in different parts of the world are more like each other than they are like their parents. It used to be the case that we didn't know very much about what was going on in other parts of the world. Now we know within 15 seconds what's happening in the Middle East or Southeast Asia. Science is increasingly a multinational activity. It's not individual scientists in their labs. Scientists are working in international teams using multiple languages through technology. An increasing international migration, which is probably at its highest point for 100 years, means that many parts of the world, most parts of the world in fact, are no longer homogeneous. They all have local diversity. So in a sense, the world is at our doorstep as well as being far away. So while we can't see what the economy of 2070 is going to look like, it looks like for the foreseeable future, about the next 30 years, it's certainly going to have the following characteristics. It's going to be heavily science and knowledge-based, and so we are all concerned with improving our students' science literacy. It's going to be resource-challenged, and I was interested to hear about the online environmental course, because I think that is something that we don't yet have in our schools very much, but our students are very interested in. It's going to be globally interdependent, and so the notion of global competence, which was formerly something that I think was just reserved for the elite students in schools and societies, is now going to be something that is going to be needed much more broadly. It's going to be demographically diverse, so that understanding and being able to interact respectfully with other cultures is going to be essential in your own community, as well as dealing across borders. And finally, it's going to be innovation-driven. I spend a lot of my time with educators in many other parts of the world, and every single country is trying to change its education system away from one that's simply the passive transfer of knowledge from teacher to student, to one in which the goal is really to encourage students to think on their own, to innovate, to question, to invent. Because of the sense that the economy, a successful economy, is going to be increasingly innovation-driven. So what does this mean for our students at a sort of person level? Many of our students are going to be selling to the world, buying from the world, working in international companies, managing people from other countries. They'll be competing with people from other parts of the world, but also collaborating with them to solve global problems. So how do we become a school that prepares students for this new world? I'd like to show you a couple of short video clips of two schools. One is an elementary school and one is a secondary school that I think have gone some distance towards becoming this kind of school. They're both American schools. I don't have videotape of schools in other places. But I think the kinds of practices that they follow have application in other places. So let's see if this works.
I come from Honduras.
Honduras. Where are you from?
Ethiopia.
John Stanford International School could have been honored for its multicultural perspective,
I come from Mongolia.
Mongolia.
or its integration of technology, art, and music, or the active participation of parents and community members.
¿Están listos todos mirando ahí?
But its main claim to fame is its language immersion approach to learning.
¿Cuántos milímetros metimos del agua? 30.
Students here choose a Spanish or Japanese language track.
水入れます。少しずつ入れてください。あり
They
ます
spend half a day studying math and science in the chosen language,
¿Cuántos milímetros se quedaron en la arcilla?
and the other half learning social studies and language arts in English.
Tell me about what happens at the beginning. Let's start at the beginning of the folktale.
When we first started, we had no idea what our curriculum should be and what we should teach in that second language. And of course we thought social studies at first because that's where all the meat is. We talked about cultures and things. Wrong. That's very abstract. So the idea was we took math and science because that's where you have a lot of the hands-on.
Whether they call it yodo or hummus, kids at John Stanford know what they're learning. While most of the students are Americans learning Spanish and Japanese, 25% of John Stanford students are immigrants who practice their newly acquired English skills by reciting poetry during the morning announcements.
Our children from other countries are learning English. Our children who are English speakers are learning Japanese and Spanish. So we really level the playing field. Everyone understands what it takes to learn a language, and everyone then begins to appreciate each other.
Visitors marvel at the school's ability to teach second language skills while constantly improving their test scores, which for 2005 showed 90% proficiency in English and 79% in math.
When you look at the background of their kids speaking totally different languages and learning another language, to have such high test scores in the state is absolutely remarkable. But it actually shows that learning in other languages actually helps in the brain development. It's that flexibility of the brain that's really helping the brain develop and will be with our kids for the rest of their life.
If I go to Japan, I want to order something to eat. I just say it in Japanese. It's easy. 僕は卵をもらいますか? That means, can I please have a hard-boiled egg?
John Stanford Labs help raise funds to pay for 6 native language instructional aids. They also support a sister school relationship with the Escuela Primaria Juan de la Valera, the public elementary school in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. Students and parents raise money for the school, which they visit during their winter break.
The kids go into the classroom for the week that we're in Puerto Vallarta. They go into complete immersion at that point. It's on the playground and everywhere. Our school offers an understanding and celebration of culture. The kids, they're just going to look at the world a completely different way. And I think that we're really fortunate to have that.
Hey, good morning, Matthew. Can you hear me fine? Yes.
It's 7:30 on the north side of Chicago.
Okay, we're mostly here. We're missing a couple of people.
And for Walter Payton High School's championship math team, it's time for donuts
With jelly.
and distance learning.
You can start with an integer like 2.
A Q&A with a mathematician in Switzerland.
There's an infinite number of integers, so there are an infinite possible number of states, and this turns out to be how you can store an arbitrary amount of information.
Matt Cook really is one of the world experts in this field. And so this is an opportunity for them to interact with somebody who's actually doing research in the area that we're talking about. And that's really neat.
At this science, math, and world language magnet, every subject seems to have a global dimension.
In a single day, we could talk about math problems from China, which is how I introduced one of my units in trigonometry, geometry problems from Japan. The possibilities are really endless.
Payton began with a vision that by putting together a great faculty of teachers who had the desire to nurture global leaders, we would be able to create a curriculum and programs to set us apart from any other high school in the nation.
One distinguishing factor is Payton's requirement of 4 years of foreign language study. Offerings include Spanish, French, Mandarin, and Japanese.
皆さん、こんにちは。
The school plays host to a steady stream of visitors.
Good morning and welcome to Walter Payton College Prep.
Like this delegation of 25 Chinese mayors.
We really want to make sure that Chicago is at the forefront of Chinese people's minds when they're thinking about the United States. So we teach our children not only the language, but we teach them the Chinese culture, and that's going to create a strong foundation for the city so that more and more business and cultural exchanges can go on in the future.
Chicago has the largest Chinese language program in the United States, with more than 6,000 students studying Chinese in 28 schools.
We have many students who are recent immigrants from Mexico, and they all speak Spanish at home, and they are learning Chinese and English at the same time. So essentially, these kids will go through 13 years of education where they're learning English, Spanish, and Chinese, and they will come out pretty much as the most marketable students in the United States.
Are you ready? And...
Je suis chaud comme un feu, je conduis sur les vendeurs.
Technology plays a key role here. from tools to create rap videos in French,
so it doesn't cut through the aorta.
to this health class where students interact with doctors performing open heart surgery at the Southside Hospital. The same technology has facilitated face-to-face encounters with students in several sister schools.
I'd love to give you some information about my school.
We connect with an all-Islamic inner-city school in Casablanca, Morocco, a school in Osaka, Japan. We have sister schools in Concepcion, Chile, and in China, and a school in Durban, South Africa.
Educators should always be looking at how can we open more doors for students. I find that when you open those doors and you expand those horizons, you never can close them. And that's going to change these students' lives and their families' lives and their communities' lives forever.
我希望的电话 electronic flower 懂 okay.
Who wouldn't want to send their students to schools like that? Well, how do schools become global schools? We've done a study of several hundred schools, again, around the United States, to try to understand what are the dimensions of becoming a global school, because every school does it differently. There's no one way to do it. But they all have a focus on producing, sometimes they call it global literacy, sometimes they call it global competence. So what do they mean by those terms? This is a fairly common definition of either global competence or global literacy. There's a knowledge dimension. It includes knowing a lot more about other world regions, cultures, economies. There's a skills dimension, which includes, yes, foreign languages, but also skills in communicating across cultures, even if it's in your own language. And very importantly, there's a values dimension of respect and concern for other people that, of course, fits very well with the Jesuit tradition. So at each society, and I don't know how well this actually shows up, the black doesn't seem to, working with the Commissioners of Education of all 50 states, we tried to come up with sort of some elements of global competence, and particularly how they actually fit with the Common Core standards. But basically, they include things like investigating the world, recognizing perspectives, communicating across cultures, and taking action. And underneath each of those, there are examples in different disciplines of how to do it. So what are the elements that we have found most common in schools that are defining their mission as producing globally competent global citizens? Well, as I said, many of them start in different places, and often they start in a very small way, with a single class or a single project. You can't do this all at once. We all know that about schools. But if you really want to have a powerful global culture in your school, the best way is to start by having your faculty decide what should your mission statement, what should your graduate profile look like. For example, the Walter Payton School defines its mission as producing graduates who will be leaders in Chicago, in the United States, and in the world. And from that mission statement flows everything they do at that school. Teachers are clearly important. Teachers can't teach what they don't themselves know or understand, and many teachers in the United States have not had a great deal of international exposure. So how do you deal with that? Because you certainly don't want teachers teaching about things they don't know about. They might teach the wrong things. So there are a variety of approaches that people take. One is in their hiring. They look for people who've had international experience, whether they are immigrants, whether they've traveled, whether they've taken a course or a language, just something that contains that spark of interest on which they can build. Some schools where there are local universities, and I recognize there aren't everywhere where your schools are, will find who are the faculty who are experts on some international topic or some part of the world, and have them come and do a workshop for their teachers. And many faculty love doing that. Travel, we all know, can be a very powerful experience. And again, there are increasing numbers of opportunities for teachers to travel through things like Rotary Fellowships, which is an international organization that supports that kind of thing. Visiting schools in other countries is a very powerful form international travel experience, because you're not just going as a tourist, you're actually sort of looking at the world through the lens of a school, and why is that school different from my school? Obviously, it requires changes to the curriculum, modernizing the curriculum for the 21st century. People tend to think of global as being, well, that's just about social studies. And of course, world history, world geography, global economics, that's all very important. But in fact, there's no subject these days that does not have a global dimension. And many of the most interesting examples of global teaching that I have seen have involved things like science, where they have students working with students in other parts of the world, often on environmental issues, where they are each collecting data on some issue in their local community and then uploading the data and comparing and contrasting. The arts are incredibly multicultural and cross-cultural these days. And of course, your school may not be near a museum or a concert hall, but increasingly, these things are all available on the web. Even career and vocational education, which people tend not to think of as having a global dimension, if you look at the 16 major career categories of the Bureau of Labor, every single one of them, that industry is becoming global. So you can think about introducing a global dimension in any subject where you have an interested teacher. Learning another language is fundamental. And in the United States, we're particularly bad at that. Less than half of our high school students have taken any foreign language whatsoever. And 70% of those who do take it take 1 year of introductory Spanish, which may give you some appreciation for the culture, but it gives you no usable proficiency in a language. Wittgenstein said, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world." So emphasizing language instruction, even though the US believes that everybody's going to learn English, so we don't need to bother, is a very important part of becoming a global school. And that means starting early, and it means insisting on several years of study so that you can really aim at a reasonable level of proficiency. Technology, digital and global go together, and technology is probably our greatest asset in helping our students to become global. 20 years ago, when I was trying to have a school become more global, it was very difficult because the textbooks didn't have material, it was very hard to get information. These days, your students can read newspapers from all over the world online, they can go to any international organization and look up material. There truly is a global wealth of information that you can tap into if you have internet access. Online courses, we heard about one in the last session. We're here in Boston, where Harvard and MIT have just announced that they are going to make large numbers of their courses available online for free. They won't all have a global dimension, but increasingly, these kinds of technologies are opening up areas of the curriculum that were simply not possible before. If you didn't have a teacher of a certain language in your school, you couldn't offer it. That's no longer true. A student ought to be able to study whatever language is of interest to them, and increasingly they're able to do it. Classroom-to-classroom collaborations, there are lots and lots of organizations helping schools do this. You can do it from something as simple as a Skype hookup to something as complex as a sort of a multi-week experiment. Publishing on the web, it's hard to get students to write sometimes, but if they are publishing for an audience that is, if not global, then at least involves other schools in other parts of the world, can be a great motivator. We have developed a series of internationally oriented schools in low-income communities in the United States, and one of them has developed an online newspaper, which is run by the students in this school. It's in New York, and they are connected to 3 schools in the Middle East. And every month, students in those schools write articles. The other school then edits those articles. They then swap them, and students comment on those articles. They learn a great deal about writing and cultural perspectives from doing things like that. And all of that is relatively easy to do because of technology. International travel, those of us who've had the opportunity to travel know how powerful a learning experience it can be. But it's very hard for schools to think about doing that on a large scale because of the expense. But your schools, because they are a global network, have a way of doing it at relatively low cost. because you can always do home visits in the school in which you are exchanging. Resources and community partnerships are very important in these schools, and you'll have noticed that in the video. No school has a lot of international resources inside its building. You have to look outside for help, and what help there is will vary depending on where you are, but there's always a lot of it. Any kind of higher education institution these days has faculty who have international expertise. They all have international students who would be happy to come into schools and talk about their country. Businesses are increasingly global, and often they are interested in talking to schools about in what ways, how they are developing their markets. And local ethnic and cultural groups are also a good resource. We somehow have to connect our local cultural diversity with global diversity. And so local groups that can bring examples of their culture into the school can be very important. And they also help to elevate the status of groups that might be quite poor in your community, but have a rich cultural tradition. So what does this mean for the Jesuit Schools Network? As I've said, there is no single way for your school to become a global school. Every school has to start with the resources they have and the people they have and the enthusiasms they have and the opportunities they have, and build towards a larger vision. So here I offer you 10 questions. I'm not going to go through them all, but my PowerPoint will be available, that you could bring your teachers together, or the network could do it as a network, to begin to think about these questions and come up with your own answers to what are the knowledge and skills you think are most important in an interconnected world. How can you change the curriculum to be more global? How can you increase proficiency in world languages? Where can you find adjunct teachers, and so on? How can you use technology? What technology do you have? What technology can you beg or borrow to do some of this? What about international exchanges with sister schools of the network? How can you find ways to stimulate your teachers' interest by bringing international knowledge to them? I know one school in South Texas that has a completely Hispanic population and a largely non-Hispanic teaching force, where they have an international book club. And every week the teachers get together once a week and they read a book from another country and they discuss it. And they have gone around the world like that. So there are very easy ways to get started. I think partnerships with other schools are very powerful, and obviously you have a network that could do that. Service learning, I think, is a very important part of this, whether it's working on a domestic issue that has a global connection, or whether it's working on a global issue directly. Those are all very engaging to students and produce an interest in those parts of the world or those issues. So I throw out here some ideas about how this network might work on these issues. I don't know the schools in the network, I don't know what's feasible, but I think you could imagine things like having teachers in schools work together to develop materials about each other's countries, joint research projects between students in different schools on environmental issues or on other issues, having every school in the network have a partner school somewhere else in another part of the world, joint service projects already through the Jesuit organization. You have kind of set up to work on that. There's a project that the National Association of Independent Schools has many schools working on. It's called Global Challenge 2020, I believe. It stems from a book, High Noon, 20 Global Challenges and 20 Years to Change Them. And it's very close to the UN Millennium Development Goals, and the students in the schools that participate all work on, together with other schools, trying to find solutions to each of these issues, some of which involve service in the local community, some of which are more analytical. Harnessing technology to promote communication among your schools, that's certainly something that could be begun. And broadening teachers' international experience and principles too, by giving them the opportunity to visit some other schools in the network. I'd be interested, I'm about to finish, in what you think the network could do. There are a lot of different places to start. There are a lot of resources out there. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. The Asia Society has published quite a few publications on this subject, of which I've been talking from one of them today, but all of them are up on the web, so you don't have to buy them. We have a lot of work on Asian languages particularly. Another resource is the Longview Foundation, for Education and International Affairs, which on its website has a very long list of resources for schools and teachers, together with the URL for all of them. So most of these resources are online, so you don't have to be in the place where the organization is. This statement could have been written by a Jesuit hundreds of years ago, but in fact it was a statement written by the UK Secretary of Education several years ago, launching a program in Britain to both internationalize the curriculum of British schools and to encourage every school in Britain to connect to a school in Europe and a school in a poor developing country. Sorry, I think I've lost a slide here. So, to sum up, what do I think a truly modern 21st century education system would look like? What would I like for my own grandchildren, which I think about a lot these days? I'd like to see a day when learning languages and cultures begins in the elementary years and can continue anywhere, anytime, through online courses. When all our secondary students have access to global content integrated into all courses, whether in science and environment, the arts, or career and technical education. When every school has an ongoing partnership with a school in another part of the world, enabling students to learn with their peers, not just about their peers. When prospective teachers have the opportunity to kindle their own excitement about other cultures so that they can instill the same curiosity in their students. And when school leaders, like modern business leaders, will share best practices with their colleagues around the world, continuously benchmarking their own schools against world-class standards of excellence and equity. I hope that the Jesuit Schools Network can become both a laboratory and a leader in this effort to give our students a classroom as wide as the world. Thank you very much.
We would like to take some time now to invite your own questions. If you have anything you'd like to ask Ms. Stewart about her presentation or about the topic in general, or perhaps even to respond to her question. What do you think the network of Jesuit schools can do?
Johannes Siedler from Germany, president of the school there. Thank you very much for your enlightening talk, embracing culture, economy, and globalization. And but I have more questions than answers. I think embracing this culture and this new development doesn't mean to just serve it and to produce students who will speed even up this development. This is what this one school said in their statement, is to produce students who will lead this world. I do love the world, I do love the 21st century. I'm very much part of that. And I might Twitter what I'm just experiencing here to my friends in Europe, but well, they're asleep now. But it's not true that a significant number of families have access to all these things you're talking about. It's just not true, I think. 80% of the world would sit here and not even understand what they're talking about. They don't even have free internet to download the free content you're talking about. So my question is, how do we embrace and love and serve this world as it is? I'm not talking about something different. But will we produce students who might have the idea to change the world and to take out some of the speed and to talk about justice? We haven't heard about justice in the last 40 minutes. So I'm a bit nervous about this ideal you're talking about. Probably this is not just what I'm just telling you, and you have a broader view, but I think it's a bit, I don't know, it's very useful to many people and cultures, what you're dreaming of.
Certainly, I recognize, I should say that I've worked all over the world. I've worked in Africa and Asia and Eastern Europe, and not just the United States, but most of these examples were American ones. I recognize that access to technology varies a lot and is a significant barrier in some parts of the world, but I also know, and I can't remember the statistics offhand, that something like 90% of the world is now wired. Now, the free part of the access is different, but most of the countries that are furthest behind in education are actually the ones that are looking to use technology the most, because their goal is to leapfrog the building of schools and to go to things that are sort of technologically driven. So while there is uneven, 2 points I guess, while there is uneven access, if you have a network of schools, you can communicate in some fairly old-fashioned ways. But I also think that within 5 years, the entire world will be wired. Then I think the issue will be cost. On the issue of social justice, I think when I talked about values, I think, behind the desire to understand other cultures is, if you are ignorant of other cultures, it's easy to look down on other cultures, it's easy to make war on other cultures. If you know something about other cultures, if you're engaged in community service projects, if you are learning with students in other parts of the world who have different religious and ethnic backgrounds from your own, I believe all of that is a significant underpinning for justice. And in fact, most of the schools that have a global dimension in their community service aspects and their communication aspects, they emphasize that. So if I didn't make that clear, I hope your question has provoked that, because that's certainly at the root of my interest in this.
Jack Peterson from Tacoma, Washington, which is in the northwest coast of the U.S. You mentioned the centrality of learning a language to having global literacy, and I totally agree. You also mentioned the United States' or Americans' tendency to say, well, the rest of the world is going to learn English. The flip side of that is that it's very difficult for students in the United States to have authentic situations where they're forced to use other languages, where they really have the opportunity to use them. Spanish is somewhat of an exception in many parts of our country. Any thoughts about the challenge of that? Because I'm concerned about students learning particularly, exotic languages, and where they're going to have the opportunity in some proximate context to use that language and really cement their literacy in that language. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess several thoughts about it. One is there's actually, the Modern Languages Association has on its website a census tract, a map of the United States. You have to sort of dig down to find it. That shows all the languages spoken in particular census areas. You would be amazed at how many languages are spoken in different census areas. Not every part of the United States, but lots of them. So it is possible to find local speaking partners for all kinds of languages. Beyond that, for languages that don't exist, I think increasingly there are opportunities. There are lots and lots of opportunities, many of them federally funded, although if the budget is cut, I'm not sure what will happen to them, for students to study in the summer in other countries, especially at the higher education level, but increasingly at the high school level too. We also work, because we do a lot of work on Chinese, we work with 100 schools around the United States, and we have linked each one to a high school in China. And they do sort of weekly Skype sessions in which the Chinese students practice their English and the American students practice their Chinese. I also know people who just do this through, through sort of telephonic, voice over IP. These things all tend to be somewhat technology focused, so it's not possible for some schools. But definitely, authentic experience is the difference between really learning a language and just kind of aping it. So.
I'm Pete Henry O from Zambia, Malawi province. Beginning a new school in a rural area of a very poor country. It's an option for the poor school, secondary school. And I'm very excited and appreciate what you've said, but I'm trying to think what that would mean for a poor students in a poor country where the major thing is to learn about their country and to learn about what could make a difference in their country. And that isn't immediately learning the global context. It certainly is in a wider sense, but that's not immediately it. And I'm just wondering whether you would have comment on that or whether anyone else would have any comment. Is what you're talking about more relevant to the United States or to Europe or some other developed country that might link with Malawi, but is it really relevant to the students in Malawi?
Yeah. Did you say Malawi? Yeah. I didn't mean to intend that you should not learn about your own country and your own culture. Obviously, that's fundamental everywhere. Sometimes people sort of make that opposition. It's either learning about North Carolina or it's worth learning about the world. It's obviously not that kind of thing. I mean, countries are globalized to different degrees, and I don't know much about. I don't know Malawi, the details of Malawi and where its economy is going and so on. But I guess I would just say I would look at that. I would look 30 years out and think, in addition to teaching them about their own country, what are the developments that are happening in Southern Africa? Maybe it's important for them to learn about Southern Africa. It's not necessarily important for them to learn about India, but just countries are increasingly, I mean, there isn't a country that isn't looking to export things. There are lots of people in Africa who now use cell phones, to do banking and commerce and to sell their products across borders and so on. So there are clearly varying degrees. There are some parts of the world that are sort of completely cut off from a globalized economy, but it's sort of vanishingly small. So I guess I would just say, you're educating students who are going to be in the workforce until 2070. So it's not just what's important now, but what might be important in 20 or 30 years' time. And so maybe it's more realistic to think about, and in fact most countries do tend to teach more about countries adjacent to them than about those that are across the world. So maybe starting off with Malawi and Southern Africa, and looking at where African economies are going and looking at what's possible. I worked with a refugee camp in Western Tanzania for Burundi refugees, where they introduced a computer center. And within a few months, the women were selling their handicrafts internationally. And that was as poor an area as you can imagine. So I don't need to be fanciful about it, but just to say, think for the future.
I'm Kaliepe Epidius from Zambia, Malawi province, the province where Pete Henry comes from. I'm quite excited about what I've heard this afternoon because I teach science and I've had experiences where I ask the students something and in no time you find that they are giving answers. They have tried to Google and they find answers here and there. It's true that our students are moving faster than us. They know a lot of things. And I think the challenge you have raised today to kind of try to move with the students is a challenge that we must all embrace. It's true that in certain cases, there are painful realities like a laptop is not available to everyone. Okay, so I think an interaction like this should be an opportunity now to say, okay, if there is Canisius High School somewhere, with more opportunities. And then there is also a poor Kanisha somewhere. Why don't you kind of twin those schools and see how you can bridge the gap between those two schools? So I think we should be looking more on the opportunities. And the interaction like this one should be able to bring out those opportunities. What are the opportunities for us to help one another? Thank you.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. I think that's a wonderful idea. And just to go back to those two videos for a moment, the school in Seattle that has adopted a school in a slum area of Mexico, not only do they send their students there for the cultural experience, but they also raise money for things to improve the school, to give it computers and so on and so forth, so they very much have that dimension. And the school in Chicago, which has, I mean, that's a well-funded school because it has video conferencing equipment and so on and so forth, but they have, with the school in South Africa, not just sent their students there, but they have raised money to bring those students to Chicago, and they are working on projects to develop those students' communities in Chicago. So it goes to the point about the social justice dimension of this. I think it's very, very true. And it's very exciting for students and very powerful for students. And frankly, I think for students in rich countries, I think it's really key that they understand those parts of the world where their other students are not so fortunate.
I would like to ask
So let me go ahead in the meantime. I was standing there kind of tentatively. Okay, I'll be very quick. Thank you, that was a fascinating talk. And I wanted to just throw out a couple of ideas and ask you a couple of questions. I'm Christina Helms. I'm a teacher at a Jesuit school in Milan, Italy. I'm an American. And of course, you know, it's a very elite school. A lot of the families are very concerned about getting their students up to speed in English. And of course, as other people have pointed out, the underlying assumption is that English is going to be, you know, the dominant commercial scientific language from here until, you know, foreseeable future. I found that the school in Seattle was quite interesting. You know, it seems to me that there are not many people who are appreciating bilingualism the way it was described in that video. First of all, because it confers real cognitive benefits on the people who practice it, but also because it allows the kids to do a continuous paradigm shift, thinking about reality in one language, thinking about reality in another language. And I was just wondering if you could comment. I know that something like 25% of the Gaokao is on English, the Chinese graduation exam. Do you think that English is going to be eventually a totally universal Esperanto, or are we going to continue to have the richness of, you know, Spanish, Chinese in ever increasing amounts?
Okay. Just to speak to your point about the bilingual immersion school model, which is, you know, an unusual model in the United States context, not in a Canadian context, obviously, but it's interesting, although there are only a few hundred immersion elementary schools in the US, but every time a new one opens, it's immediately oversubscribed. I actually think younger parents, because they are more global in their, you know, they've grown up with the internet and so on, they appreciate language more. There are a number of states that are now starting bilingual programs. The state of Utah, out of its own tradition, is starting 100 language immersion elementary schools in 8 different languages, because they want to take what's in their tradition and use it for, you know, to prepare students for a different kind of world. So I actually see that as kind of a hopeful sign. So on the question of the dominance of English, it is true that because English is a commercial lingua franca, that other countries are putting a huge emphasis on having their students learn English. But if you speak to people in business, they will say, you can buy in English, but you have to sell in the other person's language. So to have everybody else understanding us and speaking our language and us not being able to understand and speak theirs actually is a huge economic disadvantage for the United States. So it's the reason why business schools are increasingly adding languages. So even if English becomes a commercial lingua franca and stays there, there are other, there are just in strictly economic terms, there are reasons for learning languages. But it's also the case, I think there are some shifts in that. Language use on the internet used to be almost a totally English medium, but other languages are increasingly growing, and so it's not clear that it's going to be an English medium solely anymore. I think linguists I've spoken to about this question say, well, there might be three global lingua franca for the next 20 to 30 years, and then beyond that, who knows, because languages decline and fall if you look historically, and those would be English, Spanish, and Chinese.
We have time for one more question.
I am from...
I'd like to ask our audience by a show of hands two questions. One, how many of their students have access to the internet at an acceptable cost? And then secondly, how many do not have access to the internet at acceptable cost? The audience.
Could you repeat what that was? We didn't quite hear what you were saying at the end.
Yes, I'd like to ask if the audience, by a show of hands, would indicate how many have access and do not have access.
So, by a show of hands, how many schools have access? It's a good note to perhaps end on. Certainly, there's a number of people who still had questions, indicative that Vivien Stewart's topic and presentation have given us a lot to think about, hopefully to continue conversations into the evening. And I think in many ways we've come full circle to Father Metz's question and challenge earlier this morning. How do we follow up on this opportunity that has been given us during these days together here at BC? How do we use this network that we have to foster and continue the goals of educating our students for global competence?